The version of Job you were taught goes like this. A righteous man loses everything. He suffers terribly. He stays faithful. God rewards him in the end. The moral: trust God even when life hurts, because He has a plan you can't see. It's a beautiful story. It's also the kind of simplification Spinoza taught you to distrust. The actual book of Job, read the way Spinoza teaches you to read Scripture, is one of the most disturbing texts in the Bible. Not because of the suffering, though the suffering is extreme, but because of what the book does with innocence. It takes a man who has done nothing wrong, destroys his life in front of him, and then refuses to give him the one thing every human being wants when they're in pain: a reason. And the ending, the part everyone remembers as reassuring, is, if you read it carefully, one of the most terrifying passages in all of Scripture. Not because God is absent, because God shows up, speaks directly, and still doesn't answer the question. The book of Job is more terrifying than you were told, not because the story is dark, but because the darkness is built into the structure. And the reassuring version you were given as a child was designed to hide it. Spinoza helps you see why, not by making the book less sacred, but by making it more legible. This is a video about what the book of Job actually says when you strip away the Sunday school summary, and about why Spinoza's way of reading Scripture is the only approach honest enough to face what's really in the text. Let's start with what happens. Job is introduced as blameless. The text is explicit about this. He is righteous, fears God, turns away from evil. He is wealthy, healthy, surrounded by children. He is, by every measure the ancient world respected, a good man living a good life. Then, in a scene most people forget, the action moves to a kind of heavenly court. God and a figure referred to as the Satan, not the red devil of later Christian mythology, but a prosecutorial figure, something closer to a cosmic district attorney, have a conversation. God points to Job as a model of faithfulness. The Satan responds, "Of course he's faithful. You've given him everything. Take it away and see what happens." God agrees. He gives permission for Job's life to be destroyed, with one condition: don't kill him. Pause on that. The suffering that follows is not a test designed by a compassionate teacher. It's the result of what can only be described as a wager. A bet between divine powers, with a human life as the stakes. Job doesn't know this. He's never told. He stands under a sky that does not explain itself, and he will stand there for the rest of the book. This framing matters, and Spinoza would immediately notice why. Because the reader knows something Job never learns. The reader has been shown the machinery behind the curtain, a wager, a test, a permission slip for devastation. Job gets none of this information. His entire experience of the story is bewilderment. He suffers without cause, protests without context, and receives a response without an explanation. Everything the reader can rationalize, it was a test, he passed, is unavailable to the man living it. The horror of Job is not just what happens to him, it's that he's never told why. What follows is catastrophic. Raiders take his livestock. Fire falls from the sky and burns his servants. A wind collapses a house and kills all 10 of his children. Then his body is covered in painful sores from head to foot. In the space of a few verses, Job goes from the most blessed man in the story to the most ruined. And he has done nothing wrong. This is the detail the comfortable reading has to suppress. It's not that Job suffers and eventually things get better. It's that Job suffers, and the text insists, from the first verse to the last, that he did nothing to deserve it. The suffering is not a consequence. It is not a correction. It is not earned. It simply arrives, like weather. Job, sitting in ashes, scraping his sores with a piece of broken pottery, becomes the image at the center of the book. The innocent man standing under a sky that doesn't explain itself. If that image disturbs you, subscribe, because it's about to get worse. Now enter the friends. And this is where Spinoza's method becomes even more useful, because the friends are not just characters. They are the theology the text is putting on trial. Most people treat the friends as minor characters. They're not. They are the most important structural element in the book. Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar arrive to comfort Job. But their comfort comes with a condition. The suffering must make sense. And the only way it can make sense in their theology is if Job deserved it. So they begin, gently at first, then with increasing aggression, to insist that Job must have sinned. Perhaps secretly, perhaps unknowingly. But the logic is airtight in their system. God is just. Suffering is punishment. Therefore, you must be guilty. This is the theology of moral reassurance. It is, in fact, the theology most religious traditions still teach. Bad things happen to bad people. If bad things are happening to you, search your conscience. The universe is fair. God is keeping score. Job refuses this. Flatly. Completely. Repeatedly. Through chapter after chapter of increasingly raw, increasingly angry protest. He does not accept that his suffering is deserved. He demands an audience with God. He wants to argue his case. He wants the judge to explain the verdict. And this is what makes Job dangerous. Not that he questions God. Many biblical figures do that. But that he questions the foundational assumption of religious morality, that suffering is proportional to guilt, that the universe operates like a courtroom, that if you are good, you will be protected. Job says, I was good. I am not protected. Your system is wrong. Spinoza would have recognized the danger of that sentence immediately. The friends respond with escalating fury, because Job's refusal isn't just personal, it's structural. If Job is innocent and suffering, then the entire moral order collapses. If good people can be destroyed for no reason, then being good is not a shield. And if being good is not a shield, then the entire basis for obedience disappears. Job's friends aren't defending God. They're defending themselves. They are terrified men performing certainty. Because each of them is rich, healthy, respected. And if Job's suffering is random, then so is their safety. The entire architecture of their lives depends on the premise that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. Job is living proof that the premise is wrong, and they would rather destroy Job's character than face that. They need Job to be guilty because the alternative, that innocence provides no protection, is unbearable. Now here's the part everyone waits for. God speaks. And this is exactly where a Spinozist reading refuses to look away. After dozens of chapters of silence, God answers Job out of a whirlwind. This is the moment that's supposed to resolve everything. And what does God say? He does not explain the suffering. He does not mention the wager. He does not say, you were being tested, and you passed. He does not say, I had a reason. He does not say, this was for your own good. Instead, God delivers a series of questions. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? Do you give the horse its strength? Does the hawk take flight by your understanding? The speech is magnificent. Poetically, it may be the greatest passage in the Hebrew Bible. It is a display of cosmic scale, the vastness of creation, the intricacy of natural law, the incomprehensible depth of a universe that existed long before humans and will exist long after. But Spinoza forces you to notice what it is not. It is not an answer. It is an act of overwhelming. God does not resolve Job's complaint. God drowns it in scale. The message is not, here's why you suffered. The message is, you are too small to ask. The traditional reading says, this is humility. This is trust. This is the proper response to divine mystery. awe before what you cannot understand. And there is real power in that reading. The Whirlwind speech is genuinely awe-inspiring. It places human suffering inside a frame so vast that the question itself seems to shrink. But the horror is still there, because the question was never answered. Job asked, "Why do the innocent suffer?" God responded, "Look how big the universe is. That is a change of subject. A magnificent, terrifying, cosmically scaled change of subject. And here is the deepest terror of the book. God speaks, and the speaking is real, powerful, and present. This is not a silent universe. This is not a God who hides. God shows up. God responds. And the response is, I am vast. You are not. And that is all you're going to get." The innocent man standing under a sky that does not explain itself is still standing there after God speaks. The sky got bigger. The explanation did not arrive. And then the epilogue. Job's fortunes are restored. He gets new livestock, new wealth, even new children, 10 more, matching the ones who died. Many readers take this as resolution. God rewarded his faithfulness. Justice prevails. Happy ending. But think about what that means. 10 new children to replace 10 dead ones. As though children are interchangeable. As though the grief of losing a child is resolved by the birth of another. The epilogue operates on the logic of property. What was taken is returned, plus interest. But grief does not work that way. The dead children are not mentioned again. They are replaced, like livestock. This is not comfort. This is the transactional theology the rest of the book spent 40 chapters demolishing. The ending feels bolted on, and many scholars believe it was. The original poem may have ended with the Whirlwind speech and nothing more. The happy ending was likely added by a later editor who couldn't tolerate a story that left the problem unresolved. And this is the kind of seam Spinoza taught you to look for. The moment a radical poem gets wrapped in a safer frame. His entire method of reading scripture was built on the recognition that the Bible is not a single, coherent, divinely dictated document. It is a collection of texts written by different authors at different times, compiled and edited with different agendas. The contradictions are not mysteries to be explained away. They are evidence of the editing process, of human hands shaping a text to serve human needs. For Spinoza, reading scripture this way doesn't destroy the text. It reveals what the text is actually made of, which is far more interesting than what the tradition claims. The Bible becomes legible in a new way, not as divine dictation, but as a record of human beings wrestling with the hardest questions existence can pose. The book of Job, read through Spinoza's method, is not one story. It is at least 2. The prose frame, the wager, the restoration, is a folk tale. The poetic core, Job's protest, the friend's accusations, the whirlwind speech, is something far more radical. It is a philosophical argument embedded inside a sacred text, challenging the very theology that the surrounding tradition depends on. And the tradition's response was to wrap the radical poem in a reassuring frame. Don't worry, he got his stuff back. Spinoza taught that scripture must be understood from itself, not from what you want it to mean, but from what it actually says when you read it without pious insulation. And what Job actually says, when you read it without the insulation, is this: innocence does not protect you. Suffering has no guaranteed moral meaning. The universe operates on a scale that does not organize itself around human fairness. And the most powerful being in the story responds to legitimate anguish, not with an explanation, but with a display of overwhelming force. That is terrifying, not because it denies God, but because it presents a God who is real, who speaks, who is present, and who doesn't owe you an answer. The innocent man standing under a sky that does not explain itself never gets what he asked for. He gets something else. The raw, uncomforting, magnificent confrontation with a reality that exceeds his categories, not justice, not comfort, scale. And the question the book of Job leaves you with is not, do you trust God? It is something harder. Can you live in a universe where trusting God does not mean you will be treated fairly? Because if the answer is no, if you need the universe to operate like a courtroom, if you need suffering to mean something, if you need the sky to explain itself, then you have not yet faced what this book is actually about. You are still sitting with Job's friends, insisting that the innocent man must be guilty, because the alternative is more than you can bear. This is the point where most religious reading retreats. Spinoza doesn't. He could bear it. He read scripture as human literature, stripped it of its comforting frames, and faced what remained. What remained in Job was not a lesson in patience. It was the oldest, most honest confrontation in all of religious writing between a human being and a cosmos that does not organize itself around human expectations. The sky does not explain itself. It never has. And the book of Job, the real book of Job, not the Sunday school version, is the one biblical text brave enough and honest enough to say so.